Hello and welcome again to Literature and Stuff with Marlin. Haha, kidding. We are going to talk about Realist and Victorian literature today, and if I am correct and the plan has been followed, etc., etc., this will be the last bit of literature that we are going to talk about in English. So let's start the show then. Realist and Victorian literature is quite funny because they're at the same time. Yes, they are, basically anyway. Realism or realist writers started to publish things in 1830-ish up until 1860-ish again, whereas Victorians also started in 1830 but continued on to the 1900s. Now, as always, we need to discuss the important events during this period, one being the American Civil War. Now, if you watched the previous video that was about romantic literature, you know that the American Civil War started then. This is where it ends. So the conclusion of the American Civil War will have some effect on literature and how we view people. We are also in the colonial era, where we expand our colonies and expand our influences everywhere. So this is quite important for Britain, because Britain is the main colonizing power of Europe. And during this time you used to say that the sun never set on the British Empire. Symbolizing then that the Brits had colonies everywhere, from the US to Africa to India and Hong Kong. So yeah, stuff was happening, and this is also a quite influential bit in literature. We also have more industry going on. This is sort of like the second wave of the industrial era. We automize more things, more people are born and move into cities. In some cases, like in Ireland, this actually led to an extreme kind of poverty where people can't even afford to buy food. So potato famine in Ireland causes a lot of people to die of starvation or move away to America to actually find a job, because that was quite difficult in Ireland at the time. Sorry, I need to shift a bit. There we go. Alright, so we have a rapid population growth in Great Britain, not only England but also Scotland and Wales and Ireland, of course. And rapid population growths are often caused by people having money and some form of stability in their lives. Because when people have stability and money to feed themselves, they tend to make babies, and yeah, that's what happens. So during the 1800s, the population in Britain grew from the 2s and 5s of millions to the 15 and 20ths of millions instead. So it's quite quite the population expansion, I should say, which in turn caused job shortages and poverty as well. We've also had the French Revolution right about the start of the 1800s. And this means that the way that society is built up has changed. So instead of having this feudal society where we had the king on top and the priests and the nobles in the middle and the farmers at the bottom of the chain where they pay all the taxes and the rest do not, we have a class-based society where everyone pays taxes, has equal-ish, I should say, rights, etc., etc. Sorry, I lost track there. Anyway, the class-based society is divided into 3 classes. We have the working class and the middle class and the upper classes, making different amounts of money, of course. We also have an important scientist at the time, Charles Darwin, who presented his theory of evolution, which had a great impact on how people think about their origins and who they are, and other sciencey stuff. And yeah, it's sort of like believing you come from a stalk to believing that there actually is something as the men and women in childbirth. That is quite a revolutionary thing. Any Hoosers, that is also an important part of the puzzle to understand. We also have a very important queen in Britain at this time, and this is Queen Victoria. The Victorian era is actually named after her. But she rules Britain. So, how does this affect literature in any way? We can start with realism and what characterizes it. Now, as you've seen probably when we've been talking about literature and stuff, different eras react to the previous one. So Romantics reacted to the logic and reason of the Enlightenment era, and now the Realists react to the Romantics' emotions and foofiness with hard, cold reality. They want to explain everything in as much detail as possible and really try to replicate reality in texts, which can be quite difficult because if 20 people walk into a room with a chair, they're still going to explain it in 20 different ways. But a fun challenge nonetheless. And the reason why they do this, other than the fact that they don't actually like the foofiness of the Romantics, is that the Civil War and the revolutions in Europe and stuff has really changed how they see people and what happens in the world. They don't believe that people are born good anymore. They sort of believe that people are born capable of horrible things. And they want to show that by writing texts that focuses on the darker parts of reality, the social misery, the wars, slavery, etc., etc. So that is why a lot of the literature from this period is quite depressing, actually. But then again, on the other hand, we have Victorian literature, where Queen Victoria is quite a big influence, actually. She had some ideals of purity and the pure and perfect person, and that was that they should be charitable, moral, brave and good and pure and honest and hard-working and dutiful and respectable. And I mean, who is she even talking about, really? Because everyone has flaws, right? But this was sort of an ideal that she wanted people to live up to, and this is also expressed in literature. You want to believe that people can be all these things, as opposed to realists who have lost hope in humanity altogether. So a lot of stories, Victorian stories, are either middle-class stories or mission stories. In middle-class stories, there are often aristocratical villains. We have a happy ending, and a lot of these are middle-class people trying to learn to be all of these ideal things that Queen Victoria wants you to be. A lot of writers here, especially in Britain, are female writers, like the Bronte sisters and Jane Austen, who write about women in middle-class families and how they struggle through life. The hero here is often a tall, dark, and handsome man, called the Byronic hero. So those things are very good to remember. We also have mission stories, and this is sort of influenced by the colonies and the church's mission to sort of, make them Christian, basically. So a lot of the mission stories are about helping the poor savages in the colonies, trying to civilize them. But here we also have the happy ending that is quite important. And what is also expressed in Victorian literature is the idea of the tortured artist, sort of the writer's way of writing him or herself into his or her work, explaining how they are tortured and misunderstood all the time. Yeah? So let's see what the next slide is. This is always exciting. Ah, yes, popular text forms. Realist literature are more fixed and I don't know, it's not so fairy tale like. So popular forms of texts here are serial novels that can be published in magazines, detective stories, or political stories, right? To either send a message or to really show the gritty parts of life. Whereas Victorian literature is more well, I don't know if that is a word, but you can interpret the texts more than you can the realist ones, I think. So you have poems and novels and short narratives that are popular. And then lastly, some important writers and what they wrote. So important realist writers then. A lot of realist writers were French, actually, so I have to have at least one French guy here, being Victor Hugo, who wrote Les Miserables and The Hunchback of Notre Dame and other things. So yeah, and that is basically Les Miserables is basically a novel that focuses on the darker side of French society and the number, I don't know, 5, 6, or 7 in turn of the revolution against the emperor, etc., etc. So yeah, and again focusing on the depressing side of life, really. We have an American guy, Mark Twain, who wrote Huckleberry Finn. It's a bit more cheerful story than Les Miserables, but still focusing on the not so shiny sides of life at all times. And then we have a Russian guy named Fyodor Dostoevsky, who wrote Crime and Punishment, and really trying to reflect not only society but raw emotion as well, like anxiety. And then we have some Victorian writers. I mentioned the Bronte sisters, I believe, writing Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights. We have Rudyard Kipling, who wrote The Jungle Book, and that is sort of like a mission story. I know you must have seen the film that was based off it. It is basically trying to help the poor savage Mowgli adjust to the British way of life, and yeah. You've seen the film, I know you have. And we have Robert Louis Stevenson, who wrote Robinson Crusoe, again, very famous story. And we have the gentleman Oscar Wilde, who wrote the book The Portrait of Dorian Gray. Focuses on criticizing beauty, actually. Very interesting book to read. If you haven't read it, you should. Now then, this is just a brief introduction to realist and Victorian literature. I hope that you've learned something, and I wish you all the best of luck in your coursework. Bye bye.